Hello, my dear friends. I hope everyone is well. Today I have a change of venue. I'm delivering my drosha in my office in the shul. There's two tremendous lessons from a Rashi in this week's parsha. The Chumash describes how Cain got into a fight with his brother Hevel. The Chumash doesn't say what they were fighting about, but plain meaning is that he was jealous of Hevel, and Cain decides to murder his brother. After that happens, God addresses Cain, and he says, "Hey Hevel, achicha, where's your brother?" And Cain pretends, and he says, "Hashomer achiini, am I my brother's keeper? It's not my responsibility." So God says to him, obviously he knows that he murdered him. He says, "Ma sisa, what did you do? Kol demei achicha tzoakim alai min adama." The sound of your the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the land. So first you see that when a person commits either an aveira or performs a mitzvah, it has an impact on the environment, even on inanimate objects. Even the land that absorbed the blood of Cain was tzoak, was crying out, kol demei achicha, the voice of the blood cried out from the land. But Rashi makes the following observation: kol demei achicha, the voice or the cry of your brother's blood. Demei is a plural. Dam would be singular. Demei is plural. So Rashi asks, why is it a plural? He only murdered one person. So where's the demei? So Rashi offers two explanations. One explanation is that this was the first murder that took place in the history of mankind. And Cain, when he wanted to murder Hevel because he was so angry at him, but he didn't know how he would affect that. So first he pierced them with a knife in one place and he started to bleed. And he thought maybe he needs to pierce him someplace else. So he pierced him multiple times and he bled numerous times because of that. And therefore the Chumash refers to it as demei achicha, the bloods of your brother. So the lesson here is that you would think that Cain, even if however angry he was at his brother, but once he stabbed him and he would see the gross imagery of his brother bleeding with the blood gushing from the wound, you would have thought that Cain would have caught himself and say, "Oy vey, what have I done? How could I commit such a crime?" But instead, not only was he not deterred, but he was only encouraged more to pursue it with greater fervor and to try piercing him another place in the body and in the foot and in the heart and in the lungs. And so you see how when a person is angry, they lose all control and their logic and natural responses completely go out the window. And therefore Cain, he just couldn't control his rage, and he continued to stab his brother. But Rashi offers another explanation, and that's what I want to focus on. Rashi says, "Kol demei achicha damo v'dam zaro." His children, the blood of his brother, v'dam zaro, and the blood of the children, of the offsprings of Hevel. So in other words, what Rashi is saying is that God was holding Cain responsible not only for the murder of Hevel, but he was responsible for all the future generations that would have emerged from Hevel had Cain not murdered him. And if you think about it, over the course of human history, the world population would have perhaps been double had Cain not murdered Hevel. So I think there's 10 billion people in the world now. There would have been 20 billion. And that's just at the present moment. So throughout the course of history, there are billions and billions of souls that were not born as a result of that crime that Cain committed. So what you see from here is a very important thing, and that is that a person is held accountable not only for her direct action, but for all the collateral effects that they may have. And when we whatever we do, we have an impact not only on ourselves, but we have an impact on our family, an impact on society, impact on the culture in which we live. And so that's like on a horizontal plane, we're responsible for that. But it's not only within our own generation or within our own time frame that we're responsible, but we're responsible also for the impact in the ripple effect in the future generations, the ripple effect, impact that it will be in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. All that is the responsibility of the individual, and that's why God holds Cain responsible for Demei Achicha, Domo v'Dam Zaro, for his children and all the descendants over the course of human history that would have emerged from Cain. From Hevel. There's a famous story. Rav Leib Hyman was a Rosh Hashiva in Torah Vidas, and Rav Leib, in the earlier part of the 20th century. So Rav Leib was delivering a shir, and it was a very frigid day, and only 5 Talmidim showed up for the shir. Only 5 Talmidim braved the weather to come to yeshiva for the shir. And Rav Leib that day gave a shir with unbelievable passion and emotion. So after the shir, one of the Talmidim said, Rebbe, there were only 5 of us here. How is it possible that you were so animated and so excited and so much passion when you're only talking to 5 Talmidim? So Rav Leib said, my dear child, I wasn't giving a shir just to 5 Talmidim. I was giving a shir to hundreds of Talmidim, to thousands of Talmidim, because the 5 Talmidim that I addressed are going to have the scores of their own Talmidim. Then the Talmidim will have more Talmidim. So he saw in front of his eyes not only the impact of the shir on the Talmidim that were sitting there at that moment, but he saw the impact as it would evolve throughout the years to come. And therefore, he was able to conjure in his mind that he wasn't giving shir to 5 Talmidim, but he was giving shir to hundreds or thousands of Talmidim. This idea was brought back, impacted on me in a very powerful way I was reading a book called Biraishis Emunah that Robert Kreitman lent to me. An amazing biography, or it's an autobiography, of Gital Halberstam, Rabbinit Gital Halberstam. She was the daughter of Rabbi Shlomo Teichtel. He was a famous Hasidic Rebbe who lived in Hungary. And at some point during World War II, he was, as much of the Hasidic community was anti-Zionist, he became a Zionist. He wrote a famous work called Ema Banim Semecha because he felt that God was upset at the Jewish people because they didn't seize the opportunity to make Aliyah and move to Eretz Yisrael. He perished tragically on a transport near the end of World War II. But his daughter, this Gital Halberstam, survived the war. And she wrote this magnificent biography. I would recommend it to you if you could handle the Hebrew. Unfortunately, it's not translated into English as of yet. It's such a powerful story of her life. And just to give you the essence of what the message that she has, she wrote this for her family, for her children and grandchildren, that they should understand what enabled her to go through the war and stay true to her Jewish roots. Before the war began, she was a young girl of about 13, her father told her that I want you to remember, no matter what happens, her father saw the winds of war arriving. And he said, no matter what will happen, I want you to remember 3 things. Number 1, you are a Bas Yisrael. You are a Jewish woman. Number 2, everything that happens to you happens from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God controls the universe. And number 3, always be besimcha. Always be in a state of happiness. And God will always be with you and will protect you. She went through the war, and she was together with she was in Auschwitz, and she had lost her parents. She was all alone, and she befriended, an older woman befriended her by the name of Zora. This was a Jewish woman who had married a non-Jew, but in spite of the fact that she did so, but Hitler didn't discriminate. So this Zora was in the concentration camp, and she sort of adopted Gital, this young girl who was totally alone, and they went through the concentration camps together. They were together for 6 years. After the war, Zora told Gital that she would like to immigrate to Brazil because she has a relative there who's a very wealthy factory owner, and he will be able to take care of them financially and provide for them security. And so Gital said, how could I do that? I made a promise to my father that I would always remember that I am a Bas Yisrael, that I'm a Jewish woman. And if I go to Brazil, I will be completely abandoning my Jewish legacy, and I'll probably end up marrying somebody out of the faith, and my children will have no connection to Judaism. How can I do that to my father, even though she realized that her father was no longer alive? But in Gan Eden, he will be so perturbed. And I made that promise to my father. And I've lived with that throughout the war. And she struggled back and forth with Zora. And at the last minute, they were in Prague, and Zora was about to book passage for them on a boat to Brazil. And Gital was enormously torn because she was extremely insecure. She didn't have a normal childhood. Her teenage years were spent in a concentration camp. She had almost no sense of self-identity, tremendous insecurity, and Zora was her one pillar of strength. And here Zora was going to abandon her and go to Brazil, and she was torn whether, on the one hand, she needed to be together with Zora, on the other hand, her promise to her father. At the last moment, there appeared a fellow by the name of Shandor Winter, and he approached Gital and he said, aren't you the daughter of Rabbi Shlomo Teichtel? He says, you know, your mother is here in Prague, or in the outskirts of Prague, and you should go and meet your mother. Gital could not believe it. It was just like beyond her comprehension. But Shandor insisted that your mother is alive, and they broke the news to her mother that her daughter was alive because they didn't want her to have a heart attack on the spot, and then she describes the unbelievable emotional reunion between herself and her mother. One of the most moving parts of the entire story. You have to read it yourself. And then she says that afterwards, this Shandor Winter disappeared. She didn't know where he went to. She didn't know where he came from. Nobody knew who Shandor Winter was, who he was. The name was unfamiliar to people who she grew up with. And she thought, who knows, maybe Shandor Winter was Eliyahu HaNavi, who came to save her from living a life of oblivion in terms of her Judaism by going with Zora to Brazil. At the last moment, she was saved by Shandor, who miraculously took her to be reunited with her mother. Amazing hashgacha pratis. But what struck me is, you see how the words of her father, Rabbi Shlomo Teichtel, before the war began in its intensity. It was already a time when Hitler was in power and there was an unbelievable amount of anti-Semitism. But her father's prophetic vision and her father's instruction to his daughter with those three messages: never forget your Jewish roots, never forget the family that you came from, never forget that you're a daughter of royalty, a Bas Yehudis, and never forget that HaKadosh Baruch Hu controls the world, and always be b'simcha, and God will protect you. She lived with that in the most horrible conditions in Auschwitz and in other concentration camps, and those words of encouragement for her father stayed with her throughout the war. And she eventually immigrated to Eretz Yisrael. She married an extremely distinguished Talmid Chacham who was a Rosh Yeshiva, and she moved to Bnei Brak. She had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who are continuing on her path and the path of her illustrious father of Yisachar Shlomo Teichtel. And all of that would have been lost had she gone with Zora to Brazil. And what was the thread that prevented her from abandoning everything that she was going to have in the future? It was the instruction of her father before the war, in a prophetic way, that he told her those three things. You always remember who you are, a Jewish woman, and everything comes from Hashem, and you should always be besimcha. It's such a powerful lesson of how a parent has an impact that lasts for years and years. And if in the case of Cain, the destruction and the damage that he did was such that it wasn't only that he murdered his brother, but called Damei Achicha, Damo B'dam Zaro. His blood and the blood of his children were calling out from the ground, because it had the crime had an impact that even today he's being held responsible for the generations that did not emerge from Hevel because of Cain's committing of murder. So if a person is held accountable for negative behavior, so Chazal always say, Mida Tova Ruba Mida Ra. Alachas Kama Kama is a Kal Chomer, that if somebody does something good, certainly he will receive reward for the impact that he has not only on his own immediate family, but on the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren and future generations until the end of time. And we should take this lesson to heart, the importance of everything that we do. Every single thing that we do leaves an impression. You know, parents do things and they think that the kids don't notice. The kids notice everything. And it's amazing to see how children, 20, 30 years after they grow up, they imitate and they duplicate things that their parents did. And even though when they were children, they argue with the parents and they fight with them and say, why are you treating me this way? And why do I have to do this? And why do I have to do that? And then when they get older, they do the exact same thing that their parents did, because the impression is there. The seeds are planted and it leaves a lasting impression. And children, just like biologically, genetically, children, their DNA is transmitted from one generation to the next. Our DNA, you could trace it, but they've been able to trace Jewish DNA. Goes by the Kohanim have a special DNA. DNA never gets lost, and it's traced from one generation to the next over the millennium. So in the same way, the spiritual impact of a person lasts for all generations until the end of time. And therefore, we should recognize the significance and importance of everything that we do. I wish everyone a very good Shabbos, and Amir Tzashem, this year should be a year of shalom and peace and simcha and health, and the pandemic should quickly come to an end, and it should be a year of great hatzlacha.